All right, we turn our attention now to the pastoral epistles. That's 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. It's interesting when we get to the end of the book of Acts, chapter 28, Paul's sitting in prison. And we know that he wrote, his prison epistles, perhaps from Rome. But it's not easy to account for the pastoral epistles by looking at the book of Acts. We don't have the description that matches what we see in the pastoral epistles. And so it is suggested by some that they were written afterwards. This is supported in the early Christian history by the church historian Eusebius, who explains their origin, that Paul, after he was in Rome, was released and he wrote these letters, and then he returned to Rome later and was killed there. But others have suggested that another way to account for this is that it wasn't Paul who actually wrote these letters at all, but one of his companions writing under his name, what we call pseudonymous writing or pseudepigraphical writing. And a part of this also, this whole nature of did Paul write it, is related to the issue that's within the letter, because Paul says, I don't allow a woman to teach or have authority over a man, and that raises all kinds of challenging interpretive questions for us still today after all these years. Now, getting a sense of Timothy and Titus, these two letters of Timothy and this letter of Titus, we want to get a sense of their context, who they were, what do we know about them as individuals. And since we do know about them from the book of Acts and other sources, Timothy's father was Greek, his mother and grandmother Eunice and Lois were Jewish. He was, according to Jewish tradition in the Talmud, that would constitute him as being Jewish. He had a good reputation in Galatia, where Paul encountered him. Paul circumcised him, and this becomes an interesting question because there's this whole debate about whether or not Gentiles need to get circumcised or not. And it's interesting that Paul would circumcise him if he was considered Jewish, but not require Titus to get circumcised. We see his name joining Paul in 5 of his letters. And in this letter, he is not Paul's companion. Instead, he is the leader of the church in Ephesus. Now, on to Titus. He was a close companion also of Paul early in his trip to Jerusalem. He was a Gentile, but Paul did not circumcise him. And that's interesting because of the kind of message that would send to the Gentiles that said, look, I don't have to circumcise a Gentile. They don't have to go through this because they're not Jews. He's working on the island of Crete, which is just south of Greece. It's this very large island. Paul says he wants to join him at Nicopolis and later returns to Crete as a bishop, according to Eusebius. Crete, again, is this large island, large mountainous island. It's famous for its legend of King Minos, and also famous for its moral faults. There's a quote that comes from one of the Greco-Roman poets who says the Cretans are always drunkards and liars. And so it had a bad reputation. The message of the pastorals could be described in some quotes. The teaching of the law deals with myths, deals with the greedy. It deals with those who reject marriage or certain foods or the New Age. It addresses those who think that resurrection may have already taken place, and a kind of Gnosticism of knowledge, salvation through gnosis or knowledge. 1 Timothy is an Ephesian church struggling with false teachings. And, Paul talks a lot about church leadership in this letter, and he seems to be combating false teachers, and so he wants to talk about the requirements, the kind of character that a leader should have. Um, why does he talk about widows? Why does he talk about money? Again, it seems to be there are some issues with perhaps widows who are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and those who are not using money the way that they should be using money. This is a simple outline of the book of 1 Timothy. So how does Paul go about combating his opponents? First of all, he deals with the dual nature of Christ that counters the heresy about marriage. Anybody who would say, marriage or sex is bad, and if Christ was human, that combats that. He encourages Timothy to stand against them. He also addresses the issue of slavery. Christians were slaves. And in fact, as we've said before, much of the Roman Empire were slaves. And it raises sort of an interesting question. Why doesn't Paul go ahead and just eliminate slavery? In fact, he almost seems to encourage it. And of course, this is an interesting question. But the truth is, he encourages everybody to serve in love. Slavery in the Roman world was very much a part and parcel of life in the ancient world. Paul doesn't seem to be interested in changing the institution of slavery as a political tool, but he is interested in seeing people set free in many cases. And he also encourages them to serve in their slavery in a way that brings honor to them and to the name of Christ. In the 1 Timothy 2:8-15 is probably Paul's most controversial, where he talks about women should not teach or have authority over men. A couple things here. One, Ephesian women had been rejecting modesty, promoting asceticism, abstinence in marriage, and avoiding pregnancy, probably out of a fear of dying in pregnancy. And at the same time, there was this proto-Gnostic heresy that saw creation as evil and elevated Eve as the source of all knowledge. So it seems to be that there's a kind of whole strange heresy that had developed in the church. When Paul tells the women to be quiet, he requests the Ephesian women who oppose Timothy to learn in submission, not usurp authority or be silent. He seems to be addressing the particular situation that they're dealing with, in which they are using their position in a way that is, inappropriate. Quiet life, it was a mark of nobility and gracious decorum. It's not meddlesome or disorderly conduct. So, it raises the modern practical question, can women be an authority in the church? What is the Greek word for authority? It's actually a word for aggressive or violent authority, which is interesting. It doesn't just describe a position of authority, but it describes a certain type of it. Is there evidence of Jewish women in authority in synagogues? I mean, do we ever find women being in any kind of leadership positions? Actually, we do. And you can see in the sidebar, Rufina, that in fact, there is evidence of this. Also, is there evidence of Christian women in early church leadership? The obvious answer is yes. In Romans 16, there are 9 women mentioned as workers, co-workers, apostles, and even a deacon in the church. What about in Titus? As we come to the book of Titus, what do we know here? Well, there's a lot of similarity with 1 Timothy in terms of its themes. They both confront false teachers. There's an issue of prophets and myths. So they're dealing with very similar themes, and you can see here the outline of the book of Titus. In confronting the false teachers, Paul says to avoid hypocrisy. As he's talking to Titus, he tells him to look at your own life first and then look at your leaders. What should they do and what should they not do? And he tells them not to divide the church, to avoid superfluous controversy. I think Paul might be surprised that we fight in the modern church about the color of our carpet or where we should put the piano. But then the more I think about this letter, the more I realize that Paul would very much expect to see problems like these. He basically ends by saying that if they're not teachable, just regard them as, for the lack of a better term, persona non grata. Just don't have anything to do with them. In 2 Timothy, this is a much different kind of letter. It's more of a prison epistle. He's dealing with the theme of suffering and martyrdom. Talks about fighting the good fight and gives the admonition to stay the course, to overcome deceitful men like Moses did in the Old Testament. Tell the truth even when people don't want to hear it. You know, the same kind of thing Moses had to do. Here's a quick outline of 2 Timothy. As we come to this end of having looked through those letters just real quickly, we're going to focus now on authorship and date, because really among scholars, one of the biggest discussions is, did Paul really write this or not? So let's first of all look at the external evidence, the evidence that we get outside of the book. And I'll just list this evidence and then I'll describe it. P46, Marcion, Apostolic Fathers. So let's start with P46. P46 stands for Papyrus 46. When archaeologists discover, or people working in museums discover a new manuscript that goes back to the early church period, they give it a number, and every time they find a new one, they give it an additional number. So this is Papyrus 46. It happens to contain this part of Paul's epistles, but it's one of the earliest records we have of Paul's epistles, but it does not contain the pastorals. So clearly the pastorals were not included among Paul's letters in this collection, and so it leads people to ask questions about, were these intended to be included or not. The manuscript, however, is incomplete and cannot definitely be determined that it had left out these, which is interesting. So the fact that it doesn't include them may actually just simply be the result of the fact that it's incomplete, not necessarily suggesting that the manuscript means that it wasn't included among the Pauline letters. So there you have kind of a case of evidence that may or may not really be that useful. Scholars think that it's unlikely that the manuscript contained the pastorals because there are only 7 leaves missing, and do not think that they could have fit on them. So there you have, they may not have been in there after all. Marcion was an early heretic who rejected everybody but Paul's writings. What's interesting is that on his list of letters, he does not include the pastoral epistles. Tertullian said the reason they were not there was because Marcion had rejected them. Among the church fathers, the apostolic church fathers, Polycarp cites 1 Timothy. Others show an acquaintance with it, like Clement, Ignatius, and Barnabas. So that was the external evidence. Now on to the internal evidence. There is internal clues of authorship. There are differences of tone, style, vocabulary from Paul's other letters. For example, he uses words like piety and sound teaching and good conscience, which he doesn't use in his other letters. Also, the themes of cross and covenant, my brothers, and freedom are missing. So how do we account for this? When we're talking about differences of words or themes or whatever, we could say Paul's older. We could say someone else wrote it. If so, we could say that if someone else wrote it, it was immediately after Paul died. Or the most likely culprit is an amanuensis, a writing secretary, perhaps Luke. And you can see the sidebar in the book on Luke. If Luke would have helped Paul write it, then that could help explain the different details. Internal evidence rejects the idea that this was pseudonymous, that it was written under Paul's name but by someone else entirely. And that is some of the specific details. For example, in 2 Timothy 4:13, he says, bring my cloak, it's cold, bring my papers. Well, why would Paul have done that? If it only makes sense for Paul to have written that if, in fact, he was the one writing the letter. The problem of the historical setting in the pastorals, there's a different kind of leadership model in the pastorals than what you see, for example, in Corinthians. In Corinthians, you had a charismatic model of leadership, but here you have an ecclesiastical model with bishops and elders and deacons. Years ago, I read a book by R. Alistair Campbell called a book on the elders, and he solved this problem by saying that household churches had various old titles for natural leaders that were sort of organic to those churches, but that Paul is advocating for the church to accept the leadership of a single individual as an overseer, like Timothy or Titus. All right, so just to kind of drill down on this pseudepigrapha or pseudonymous authorship, let's just quickly mention something about the fact that this was a common practice in the ancient world, but that the early church does not seem to have done this. And the evidence is the fact that in the 2nd century, when people did do this, they were then rejected by the early church. And there's a long list of what we call New Testament apocryphal gospels, like the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Thomas, that were rejected by the church because they actually were written under the assumed name of one of the apostles, but the early church knew that they hadn't really written them. So why did the early church reject pseudepigraphical writings? Because the early church put a great emphasis on genuine authority, not merely the appearance of apostolic authorship. Now, if it's not Paul that wrote it, then it could be in the 2nd century. If it's Paul, it seems most likely to have been written in the mid to late 60s. That would put us, in terms of Paul's, experience in Roman imprisonment. So 1 Timothy and Titus would be written first, and then 2 Timothy when Paul was back in prison in Rome and would then be killed under Nero on June 9th of 68.